You think you're above us now? That was the first thing out of his mouth. Louder than the television humming in the background, sharper than the smell of burnt onions seeping from the kitchen. His voice carried through the thin walls of our old house, shaking the picture frames that had been crooked for years but no one ever bothered to fix. And before I could even answer, before I could remind him I was still his daughter, his hand came crashing down on my laptop. Imagine your own father smashing your future in front of you. What would you do next? Don't miss a second of this story because the revenge starts here. The sound was worse than I imagined. A metallic crack, a screech of plastic glass shattering across the kitchen table. My $2,400 laptop, my lifeline, my entire presentation for the hotel pitch in the morning, gone in an instant. The screen split like a spiderweb. Pieces scattered onto the linoleum floor, skittering beneath the refrigerator. I didn't scream. Not once. Instead, I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my eyes locked on the broken device. Calm on the outside, even though I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I learned long ago not to give him the satisfaction of my tears. Mom stood a few feet away, her apron still tied, her eyes glued to the floor. She didn't flinch when the laptop broke. She didn't protest. She didn't move. Her silence was worse than his rage. It was the silence of someone who had made peace with cruelty. It was late, 9:47 p.m. I remember the clock because I couldn't stop staring at it, watching the red digital numbers glow against the dark kitchen. The tick of the ceiling fan, the flicker of the overhead bulb, the faint honk of a car passing outside, it all pressed in around me. Ordinary sounds, but each one felt exaggerated, as if the world was mocking me for thinking I could build something better than this house. Dad leaned in close, the sour stench of whiskey on his breath. "Leeches like you don't belong in places like that," he hissed, his spit flecking my cheek. I should have said nothing. That's what he expected. Instead, I tilted my head, wiped my cheek with the back of my hand, and let the smallest smile form. A smile I didn't mean. Because what he didn't know was that I had already backed up everything. Every slide, every chart, every word of my pitch. My work wasn't trapped in the wreckage on the floor. My secret sat quietly in a flash drive tucked deep inside my purse, resting beneath my chair like a hidden card no one had seen me play. But still, watching the wreckage scattered across the floor, I couldn't help but feel the sting. Not because of the laptop itself, but because of the years leading up to that moment. Years of being told I wasn't enough. Years of being mocked for trying. Years of having my victories twisted into insults. My father had always been like this. Loud, controlling, determined to crush anything that didn't orbit around him. And my mother, always quiet, always fading into the wallpaper. I used to think she was protecting me by staying silent. Now I knew better. Her silence was her choice. The burnt onions hissed in the pan, smoke curling up like a signal no one outside would ever notice. The kitchen smelled of char and grease, the air heavy with the kind of tension that made you feel like your skin might split. "You hear me?" he barked, slamming his fist on the table. The cracked pieces of the laptop jumped. "You don't belong." I finally looked up, met his eyes, and held his gaze. "Come." So, he was waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I simply whispered, "I hear you." The strange thing about nights like that is how long they stretch. Minutes feel like hours. The silence between words feels heavier than the words themselves. My father paced, muttering curses under his breath, his boots dragging against the old floorboards. Mom tried to busy herself, scraping the burnt onions into the trash, running water over the pan. But her hands shook. The sound of the water was too loud, as if she wanted to drown out what had just happened. I bent down slowly, carefully picking up the pieces of glass and plastic from the floor. The edges sliced into my fingertips, but I didn't stop. I dropped them one by one into the trash can, each clink like a funeral bell. Dad laughed when he saw me do it. A deep, ugly laugh. "Look at you," he said. "Crawling on the floor for scraps. That's where you belong." I didn't answer. I just kept cleaning, calm, methodical. And as I picked up the last piece, I caught a glimpse of myself in the dark window above the sink. My reflection stared back, eyes steady, jaw tight. For the first time, I didn't see the daughter they thought they'd broken. I saw something else. Someone else. The night dragged on with small, sharp details I can't forget. The way the television buzzed with static in the living room. The way Dad's cigarette ash kept falling onto the floor he refused to sweep. The way Mom handed me a damp rag without saying a word. her eyes flicking toward me then quickly away. At one point, Dad stumbled to the fridge, pulled out a beer and crushed the can against the counter after one sip. The sound echoed, metallic and final. "You think you're smarter than us," he muttered, "but you'll come crawling back. They always do." I folded the rag neatly, placed it on the counter and finally spoke. My voice was steady, quieter than the hum of the fridge. "Maybe." He froze, can still in his hand, foam dripping onto the floor. "What did you say?" I met his eyes again, calm, deliberate. "Maybe." Nothing more. That was the moment the tension shifted. Not gone, not resolved, but different. Because for once, I wasn't the one trembling. I went to my room soon after, stepping over the shards we hadn't bothered to sweep up, the soles of my shoes crunching on glass. My room smelled faintly of old laundry, the wallpaper peeling at the corners. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding. The laptop was gone. The pitch was tomorrow. My parents thought they had one. But I had the flash drive. I had the backup. And I had something else. A plan forming in the quiet of my chest, steady and sharp. I opened my purse, slid the flash drive between my fingers and held it tightly in my palm. The tiny piece of metal felt heavier than anything in the house. My secret advantage. My quiet weapon. From the other side of the door I heard Dad's voice again, muffled but still cruel. "She won't make it. She never does." Mom didn't answer. I smiled to myself, a small, private smile. They thought they'd ended me. They had no idea what I was about to do. The night ended not with shouting, not with another smashed object, but with silence. A silence that wrapped around the house like a shroud. I lay awake, listening to the faint buzz of the fridge, the creak of the pipes, the sound of Dad snoring in the living room chair. My fingers never left the flash drive. My heart never slowed. The betrayal had happened. The damage was done. But in the quiet of that room I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tomorrow, everything would change. That was the thought that carried me through the night. My fingers curled tight around the flash drive, the small piece of metal digging into my palm until it left a mark. Sleep never came. I just lay there in the stillness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house breathe around me. The pipes groaned. The fridge hummed. Dad's snoring rattled through the thin walls like thunder rolling far away. By morning my eyes were raw, my throat dry. But when I rose I felt sharper than I had in years. No fear. No hesitation. Just a strange calm. I dressed quietly, pulling on the only blazer I owned, navy blue with a loose button that I pressed flat so it wouldn't show. The blouse underneath was faded at the cuffs, but it was clean. I brushed my hair until it lay smooth, pinned it back and dabbed on the last bit of powder from a cracked compact. From the kitchen came the sound of Dad's boots dragging, the scrape of a chair. He was already awake, coffee sloshing into his chipped mug. Mom moved silently around him, her steps soft, her apron tied tight as if her whole life was measured in chores. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. But I felt their eyes all the same. "You're wasting your time," Dad muttered, not even lifting his head. His voice was hoarse from smoke and whiskey. "They'll see through you in seconds." I poured water into a glass, took a slow sip and set it down without answering. My silence was deliberate, a blade turned on its edge. The bus ride into the city was crowded, the air thick with damp coats and stale perfume. I sat near the back, the flash drive safe in my purse on my lap, both hands gripping the straps as if someone might try to steal it. Outside the fogged window, the streets blurred past, gray sidewalks, newspaper boxes, a line of schoolchildren holding hands in bright coats. My stomach tightened with every turn of the wheels. I could still hear the shatter of my laptop, still see the smug satisfaction on Dad's face. But I also felt the weight of the flash drive, solid and real. My hidden card. Halfway through the ride, a man in a rumpled suit leaned over and asked, "You giving a presentation today?" He nodded at the binder balanced on my knees, the one holding printed notes I'd stayed up copying just in case. "Yes," I said simply. My voice came out steady, surprising even me. "Good luck," he offered, leaning back again. That small exchange, ordinary as it was, felt like a spark. A reminder that the world outside my house didn't know me as the failure my parents painted. To a stranger, I was just a woman on her way to something important. The hotel rose up against the skyline as the bus pulled closer, tall, polished glass reflecting the pale morning sun. My throat tightened at the sight. It was nothing like the sagging house I'd left behind. Clean lines, shining floors, men and women in pressed suits moving with purpose. I stepped off the bus and stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at my cheeks, the sound of traffic pressing from all sides. Then I walked forward, every step deliberate, my heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, the lobby smelled of lemon polish and brewed coffee. A chandelier glittered overhead, scattering light across the marble floor. I smoothed my blazer with my hands, clutching my purse tight. My reflection in the glass doors was pale but composed. Conference rooms down the hall. The receptionist told me after I gave my name. Her smile was professional quick. I followed the signs, each step echoing. The boardroom was larger than I expected. A long polished table, sleek black chairs, water glasses lined up like soldiers. Men in dark suits already filled half the seats, murmuring to each other, checking watches, glancing at papers. A few women too, sharp, confident, their hair and makeup flawless. When I entered, the room grew quieter. Eyes turned. For a moment, the weight of those stares pressed heavy on my chest. I could almost hear Dad's voice. "They'll see through you in seconds." But then I reminded myself, they don't know the house I came from. They don't know the broken laptop on the floor. They only know what I choose to show them now. I took my seat at the far end, the projector waiting, its black cord curling across the floor like a snake. My hand slipped into my purse, brushing the flash drive, the cool metal steady against my skin. When it was my turn, my heart pounded so hard I thought they could hear it. I rose, smoothed my blazer again and walked to the front. The projector light flicked on, humming softly. "Good morning," I began. My voice wavered for half a second, then steadied. "Thank you for giving me this time." Slides appeared on the wall. My slides saved, preserved. My work intact. Relief spread through me like warmth in winter. I moved through the first points carefully, my words measured. Eyes followed. A man in the middle leaned back with a skeptical frown, arms crossed. His expression was too familiar. Dad's smirk, Dad's doubt. For a moment my breath caught. But then I clicked to the next slide. Numbers filled the screen. Proof. Facts. The room shifted. Pens moved across paper. Heads tilted forward. The man's smirk faltered. As I spoke, the tension in my chest loosened. The words came easier, flowing smoother, each one landing heavier than the last. I wasn't just reading slides. I was telling them something I had built from the ground up, piece by piece, late nights and early mornings. Every nod, every scribbled note, every flicker of surprise across their faces. Each one was a small victory. At one point, a woman near the front raised her hand. "You said you gathered these figures over the last year. How did you manage consistency?" My palms were damp, but I smiled. "Discipline," I said. "And backup plans." The room chuckled lightly, not knowing how sharp that truth cut. When I reached the end, I paused, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I know what it's like to be underestimated," I said, my voice firm now. "But results speak louder than doubts." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of people considering, weighing, measuring. Then applause. Not thunderous, not wild, but steady and deliberate. It filled the room, echoing against the glass walls. I felt my throat tighten, heat pricking behind my eyes. Not from weakness, never again from weakness, but from the sudden release of everything I'd carried. Afterward, as the investors filed out, one of them paused beside me. An older man with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong," he said quietly. For a moment I couldn't speak. I just nodded, gripping his hand tightly. As he walked away, I glanced down at my purse. The flash drive was still there, hidden safe. And yet, even in that victory, a thought whispered in the back of my mind. What happens when they find out what else I've kept hidden? I left the hotel hours later, the city buzzing around me. The sky had turned overcast, clouds rolling in heavy. The sidewalks were wet from a drizzle that must have passed while I was inside. My reflection in the glass doors as I walked out was different this time. Not pale. Not small. But steady. Still, as I boarded the bus home, I couldn't shake the weight pressing on my chest. The pitch was over. The deal wasn't final, but it was close. Yet something told me this wasn't the end of the fight. Because back home my father's words still lingered. My mother's silence still echoed. And I had more than one secret in my hands. Secrets that could break far more than a laptop. The bus jolted to a stop and I gripped the rail to steady myself. My reflection in the fogged glass stared back. Older than I remembered but sharper somehow, steadier. The pitch was behind me, yet the words of my father still clung to my skin like smoke. You don't belong. By the time I stepped off at the corner near our street, the drizzle had turned into a fine mist. The air smelled of wet asphalt and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. My shoes left prints on the cracked sidewalk as I walked the last block home. The house came into view, sagging gutters, chipped paint, the porch light flickering like a tired eye. The place where every insult had been carved into me, where every attempt at rising had been mocked. It looked smaller now, almost fragile against the gray sky. I paused at the gate, the metal squealing when I pushed it open. For the first time I didn't feel dread looking at that house. I felt something colder, sharper. A thought that startled even me. This won't be yours much longer. Inside, the television blared a game show, laughter canned and hollow. Dad sat in his chair, boots kicked up, a half-empty bottle on the table. Mom folded laundry in silence, her movements mechanical, her eyes dull. Neither asked about the pitch. Neither cared. I set my purse down carefully, the flash drive still tucked safe inside, and slipped past them to my room. The air smelled faintly of stale smoke and fried grease, the sense of a life that had trapped me for too long. I closed my door, leaned against it, and opened the folder I had carried all day, the one that held not just my notes but copies of something else. Papers I had been gathering in secret. Unpaid bills, overdue notices, debt records. Their names on every line. They had mocked me for years, called me a burden, a leech. But in my hands were the receipts of who had truly been draining whom. The next morning I rose before either of them stirred. The house was quiet, the floor cold under my feet. I slipped into the same blazer, smoothed my hair and tucked the folder into my bag. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and exhaust from early commuters. I walked quickly, each step fueled by the memory of Dad's laughter, by the silence of Mom's eyes when she looked away. The county office wasn't far. A plain brick building with peeling paint, a flag snapping in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Property deeds and transfers? I asked at the counter. My voice came out calm, steady. Down the hall, room 214, the clerk replied, barely glancing up from her screen. Room 214 was lined with metal filing cabinets, the air heavy with the weight of 1,000 forgotten signatures. A man in a tan sweater sat behind the desk, his glasses sliding down his nose. I'd like to make a purchase, I said, setting the folder on the counter. His brows lifted as he opened it. Page after page their debts stared back. He read carefully, then looked at me. Are you certain? Yes. My voice didn't waver. I want the deed transferred. Today. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It can be done. But it won't be cheap. I slipped the signed contract from my bag, the one I had left the hotel with yesterday. Not final but strong enough to guarantee. The man's eyes widened when he saw the stamp, the seal. Then let's begin, he said. The process was tedious. Forms, signatures, notarizations. The pen felt heavy in my hand, the paper rough beneath my palm. Each stroke of ink was a cut into the past, each page a quiet blow against the voices that had caged me. Hours passed. The man shuffled papers, typed on his computer, stamped pages with finality. The sound of the stamp echoed in the small room, louder than it should have been. Finally, he slid a thin folder across the desk. My name was on it now. I placed my hand on it, the paper cool against my skin. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stared, the truth settling slowly, heavier than I expected. The house where I had been mocked, diminished, humiliated, was mine now. Walking back to the bus stop, the folder tucked under my arm, the world felt sharper. Colors brighter. The sky had cleared, the clouds breaking apart, streaks of sunlight cutting through. People passed me on the sidewalk. Women with strollers, men in work boots, teenagers with backpacks. None of them knew what I carried. None of them knew the battle I had just won in silence. When I reached the corner, I stopped and turned. From where I stood, I could see the roof of the house, sagging but familiar. My chest tightened. It looked the same as always. But it wasn't. Not anymore. I smiled, a small, controlled smile. One I didn't mean. That evening, I sat quietly in the living room while Dad complained about the cost of gas. Mom mended a shirt with trembling hands. They didn't notice the folder in my lap. They didn't notice the way my fingers traced the edge of the paper. Lazy government, Dad grumbled, shaking his head at the news. Everything's stacked against people like us. I looked at him, really looked. The lines etched deep into his face, the bitterness in his eyes. He had built his pride on breaking others. But he hadn't noticed that the ground under him was already shifting. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to throw the folder onto the table, to watch his face as he realized the house was no longer his. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I folded it shut, slipped it back into my purse and said nothing. Because silence, I was learning, could be sharper than any word. The days that followed were ordinary on the surface. Dad's rants, Mom's silence, the same meals, the same routines. But underneath, everything was different. I watched them more closely now. Every bill they ignored, every envelope shoved into a drawer, every careless word they spoke while the roof above their heads no longer belonged to them. At night, I lay awake, listening to the old house groan, the pipes rattle, the walls creak. Each sound was mine now. Each corner, each crack, each flaw, mine. And with every creak, every groan, I felt a power I had never known before. One evening, Dad slammed his hand on the table, demanding money for repairs he'd never make. "You live here too," he barked. "You should be paying your share." I looked at him, calm, unblinking. My heart raced, but my face stayed still. "Maybe I already am," I said softly. He frowned, confused. But before he could ask, I rose, carried my plate to the sink and left the room. Upstairs, in the quiet of my room, I pressed the folder flat against my chest. The paper edges dug into my skin, a reminder of what I held. They thought the house was theirs. They thought I was still powerless. They had no idea. I stood at the window that night, watching the porch light flicker, listening to the hum of the fridge below, the muffled sound of Dad's voice rising again. The house had always felt like a cage. But now it felt like something else entirely. It was mine. And soon they would know it. That thought echoed in my chest as I woke the next morning, the folder still pressed beneath my pillow like a secret I wasn't ready to share. The house groaned around me, pipes rattling with the morning rush of water, footsteps dragging on the floorboards below. For years those sounds had meant dread. Today they meant something else: ownership. Control. I slipped from bed, brushed my hair into a tight knot and dressed with deliberate care. My hands didn't shake the way they used to. My steps down the narrow staircase were measured, steady. Dad sat at the table, coffee steaming in front of him. His eyes flicked up, narrowed, then dropped again to the newspaper. Mom busied herself at the sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scrubbing at a pan that didn't need it. Neither spoke. For once, I didn't feel small in that silence. I felt taller. Stronger. Their quiet no longer suffocated me. Gave me power. The first notice arrived that afternoon. I was the one who opened the door when the mailman dropped the envelope through the slot. A thin white envelope, no return address, marked in red, "Past due." I held it in my hands for a moment, tracing the corner with my thumb before setting it on the counter. Dad grabbed it later, tearing it open with a grunt. His face hardened as he scanned the page. "Damn vultures," he muttered, crumpling it in his fist. "They'll get nothing from me." I said nothing. I just watched. His jaw twitched, his shoulders stiffened. For the first time I saw not defiance, but fear creeping at the edges. The days blurred into a rhythm. More envelopes. More notices. A yellow slip taped to the door. Dad's voice rising louder with each one, cursing names, spitting threats at companies that would never hear him. Mom grew quieter still, her silence no longer protective but brittle. She avoided my eyes when we crossed paths in the hallway, as if she already suspected something had shifted. At night, I sat by my window, the cool glass against my forehead, watching neighbors glance toward our house as they passed. Whispers carried on the sidewalk, heads turning quickly away. The house had always been loud with my father's voice. Now for the first time the silence pressed harder. Not mine but theirs. It was a Tuesday when I finally slid the eviction papers across the table. Dad had been ranting again, pacing the living room, boots stomping hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Mom sat curled at the end of the sofa, knitting with trembling fingers, the yarn slipping from her lap. I placed the envelope in the center of the table, its seal unbroken. "What's this?" Dad snapped, snatching it up. He ripped it open, scanned the first lines and froze. his face drained of color, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. Mom's knitting slipped from her hands. The needles clattered against the floor. "What is it?" she whispered. He slammed the paper down, fists trembling. "They can't do this." But his voice cracked on the last word. Mom reached for the paper, her lips moving silently as she read. Her hand went to her mouth. For a long moment she just stared, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. Finally she turned to me. "Did you know about this?" Her voice wavered, softer than I'd ever heard it. I held her gaze. "Yes." The room went still. Dad's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white. Mom's silence broke into a sound I'd never heard before. A sharp, gasping sob. The roles had shifted. Their voices, once weapons, were breaking under the weight of my calm. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, neighbors whispered openly at the fence line. Mrs. Lang from across the street avoided Dad's wave, her eyes sliding to the ground. Mr. Henson, who had once shared beers with him on the porch, crossed the street to avoid walking past. I watched it all from the steps, the cool wood beneath me, the folder balanced on my lap. Their pride was unraveling thread by thread. That evening, Dad slammed the door behind him after another shouting match with a creditor on the phone. "This is your fault," he hissed, his eyes burning into mine. "Always showing off, always thinking you're better." I rose slowly, my hands steady at my sides. I never raised my voice. Not once. "But I told you I heard you." He blinked, confusion flickering in his anger. I stepped closer, close enough to see the beads of sweat on his brow. "Now it's your turn to listen." But I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Instead I turned away, leaving him standing in the doorway with his rage twisting into something else. Something quieter. Mom followed me into the kitchen later, her voice low, pleading. "Please, if you know something, tell me. We can fix this. We can talk to them." I turned to her, the overhead light casting deep lines across her tired face. "I tried talking," I said softly. "For years." Her eyes welled, but she said nothing. For the first time her silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like defeat. More envelopes arrived, each one heavier than the last. Dad stopped answering the phone. Mom stopped opening the curtains. The house grew darker, dimmer, as if even the walls had learned to cower. Me. I moved through it all with quiet certainty. Each sound of the mailbox, each knock at the door, each neighbor's glance. It wasn't shame I felt anymore. It was control. One evening I stood in the living room doorway while Dad hunched in his chair, head in his hands. Mom sat beside him, her shoulders trembling. The television flickered soundlessly, the room bathed in the blue glow. I thought of the years I had sat in that same silence, broken by their words, crushed by their laughter. Now they sat in it, unable to fill it, unable to escape it. And I realized then what true fear sounded like. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't rage. It was silence. That night I lay in bed, the folder on my nightstand. My fingers traced the edges as the house creaked and groaned around me. For the first time I wasn't the one lying awake in fear. I closed my eyes, a small smile tugging at my lips. Not a smile of joy. Not of triumph. But of certainty. Because the silence I had endured for years had finally turned. And now it was theirs. The silence I had lived with, endured, swallowed for years. It no longer belonged to me. It hung heavy on them now, pressing down like a storm cloud. I could feel it in the floorboards beneath my feet, in the walls that seemed to shrink tighter around their bent shoulders. The next morning I rose early. The house was dim, curtains drawn, air stale with the sour mix of smoke and unwashed clothes. I moved through it quietly, my hand brushing the folder on my nightstand one last time. Today I didn't need to hide it anymore. Downstairs, Dad sat slumped in his chair, the paper unopened on the floor. Mom stood at the sink, not washing dishes, just staring out the window as if she expected someone to arrive. Her shoulders sagged, her frame smaller than I'd ever noticed. I set the folder on the table with a soft thud. Both of their heads turned. Dad's voice was low, cracked. "What now?" I slid the papers out slowly, each page deliberate, the sound of shifting paper louder than his voice. Deeds. Notices. Final signatures. My name clear and bold at the bottom. "This house," I said quietly, "isn't yours anymore." For a moment neither moved. Mom's hands clutched the edge of the sink. Dad's jaw twitched, his eyes darting across the pages like he couldn't believe what he saw. You're lying, he snapped, though his voice shook. You can't. I pushed the final sheet forward. The seal glimmered under the kitchen light. Read it. His eyes scanned slower this time. His lips moved silently as he read, then stopped. His shoulders slumped. Mom sank into the chair across from me, her eyes wet. How? She whispered. I looked at her. While you were silent. While you both mocked me. I was paying attention. I kept everything, your debts, your signatures, your refusals. And when the time came, I used them. Her lips trembled, but no words came. For years, her silence had been my prison. Now it was her chain. Dad shoved back his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. You think this makes you better? You think you've won? I met his fury with calm. No. This isn't about being better. This is about survival. His fists clenched, but for the first time his rage looked empty. The eviction arrived 2 days later. The notice taped to the front door fluttered in the cold wind, the black letters bold against white. Neighbors slowed as they walked past, eyes widening, whispers spreading. Mrs. Lang stood at her fence, arms crossed. Mr. Henson shook his head, muttering to someone at his side. The house that had once been a stage for Dad's laughter and Mom's silence was now their spectacle of ruin. I stood on the porch watching the folder in my hands. Dad ripped the notice down, crumpled it and hurled it into the yard. But his hands shook. Mom stayed inside, curtains drawn tight, her shadow flickering faintly against the window. For the first time I didn't hide. I met every neighbor's eyes. Let them see. That evening the house was quiet. Dad didn't turn on the TV. Mom didn't cook. They sat together at the table, heads low as if waiting for a verdict. I placed the keys on the table between us. This place was never home, I said softly. Not for me. Not with the way you treated me here. Mom's eyes lifted, red and swollen. What will you do? She whispered. I looked around at the cracked walls, the sagging ceiling, the peeling paint. What you never let me do. Leave. The words landed like a blow. I packed slowly, deliberately. Just one suitcase, the essentials. Clothes, a few books, the flash drive that had carried me through. In my room I paused by the window one last time. The porch light flickered below the same way it always had, dim and tired. I traced the edge of the curtain with my fingers, remembering all the nights I had stood here, trapped, afraid to breathe too loudly. Now the air felt lighter. I zipped the suitcase and carried it downstairs. Dad glared from his chair but didn't move. His silence was heavier than his words had ever been. Mom's hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white, but she said nothing either. I placed the folder on the counter, the deed on top. The house is mine now. What happens next is my choice. Their eyes widened, but I didn't explain further. Some truths didn't need words. When the moving truck pulled into the driveway the next morning, neighbors gathered at their windows. Whispers drifted across the street, but no one came close. 2 men carried boxes past Dad, who sat frozen on the porch steps. Mom hovered by the door, wringing her apron in her hands. I signed the final papers with the movers, the ink dark and certain. My name on every line. As the truck pulled away with their belongings, the house stood bare. Empty. Silent. I walked through each room slowly. The living room where insults had echoed. The kitchen where silence had suffocated me. The hallway where I had walked with lowered eyes. Step was mine now. In the empty living room, dust motes swirled in the sunlight streaming through the open curtains. The walls were scarred, the floorboards worn, but for the first time it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like freedom. I pressed my hand against the cracked wall, feeling the rough texture beneath my palm. It's mine, I whispered. Not with joy. Not with pride. But with certainty. Mom appeared in the doorway, her eyes red, her lips trembling. Where will we go? She asked. I turned to her. Where I once had to go. On your own. Her face crumpled, but I didn't waver. The silence she had given me for years was finally hers to carry. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the sky clear. The porch boards creaked under my feet as I closed the door behind me. The key turned in the lock with a final click. Dad muttered something under his breath, but his voice was too low, too broken to matter. I walked down the steps, suitcase in hand, the folder tucked beneath my arm. Neighbors watched from across the street, their eyes wide, their whispers sharp. For once I didn't feel their judgment. I felt their acknowledgement. At the end of the block I paused and turned back. The The house stood small and worn just as it always had. But it was no longer theirs. It was no longer my prison. It was my victory. I adjusted the strap of my suitcase, the weight pulling on my shoulder but not slowing my steps. Each stride away from that house felt lighter, freer. I wasn't just walking away with paper or keys. I was walking away with something far greater. What I carried with me was not just revenge. It was silence turned into strength. Betrayal turned into power. I had taken everything they tried to crush me with and I had built my freedom from it. And as I walked down that cracked sidewalk, the morning sun warming my face, I knew this truth. I hadn't just bought the house they mocked me in. I had bought back myself. If this story left you breathless, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe now for more powerful revenge and betrayal stories that speak to women like us.